Good evening and welcome to Quantum Factor, the show that explores the nature of reality and the mysteries of the mind. I'm your host, Alison Hill. Scientists have claimed that we use less than 10% of our brain's capacity and that a lot of human potential lies dormant because most of us don't know how to access the rest. Now, tonight's guest is here to share with us how we can utilize more of our brain power and change our lives forever. Dr. Joe Dispenza is a research scientist and practicing chiropractor who is featured prominently in the hit movie What the Bleep Do We Know. He has spoken to audiences worldwide about neurology, brain chemistry, consciousness, the mind-body connection, stress, and emotional addictions. Joe, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure to be here, Alison.
Well, you spent about 20 years researching and exploring basically the inner mind, the inner workings of the brain and how it affects outer reality. Can you talk about your background and how you got started in this?
Sure. I studied biochemistry at Rutgers University, and then I went on to get my degree in chiropractic in Atlanta, Georgia at Life University. Then during that time I've done various brain imaging seminars, and I've done a lot of continuing education on brain physiology. And I've been a student around the School of Enlightenment for 17 years. And in the last 7 years, I actually had the opportunity to be an instructor teaching beginning level courses for beginning students. And I think that was an important part in my, in my learning.
No, before we go any further, can you explain what Ramtha School of Enlightenment is, what people do there?
Well, it's a school in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and it's a school that really inspires people to apply the principles of mind to get what they want in their life. In other words, reality really means our life. So how can we then begin to apply the principles of mind over matter? And so the disciplines are designed so that students have measurable changes in their own brain physiology and as well as in their life.
So how do they achieve these changes? I mean, it sounds so simple to talk
well,
about.
it's actually it's not that it's simple, it's just that it's presented in a way that people can understand. It's a contemporary school of wisdom, of ancient wisdom actually, and the premise is give people knowledge and information, give them the proper instruction, and then teach them how to apply it so that they can produce some type of modified behavior to produce a different result in their life. And it's pretty effective.
No, is it based on the ancient mystery schools?
Yeah, actually,
tradition?
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what are some of the amazing things that we can do if we know how to use our thoughts properly?
Well, I think that most of the time we mismanage our thoughts because the majority of our time in our waking day, we spend most of our time responding to the environment. And if we continuously respond to the environment, then the environment is activating circuits in our brain, and we're thinking equal to our environmental stimuli. Most of the information that's wired in our brain is information that we already know or that we've already experienced. To be able to then become cause in your reality or cause in your environment means then that you have to develop the skill of concentration, develop the skill of observation, develop the skill of paying attention, being able to focus and concentrate beyond the body and its needs, beyond the environment and beyond time. And students in the school, for example, which sparked a lot of my interest in spontaneous remissions, now the first thing that they always tackle is their health, because it's the closest, our body is the closest thing to our reality. And so students are taught that diseases that manifest in their body are the direct result of mismanagement of their thinking. And so there's been numerous cases where people have had changes in their health.
And what happens in the brain when we change our thought pattern, when we change our mind, so to speak?
Well, changing your mind is kind of an interesting concept because up until recently, science knew very little about the mind. They thought that it was just some etherical concept that existed separate from the body, but now what we're beginning to realize is that through functional brain scans and later technology that's been developed, that mind really is the brain in action. It's the brain at work. It's what the brain does. And so we have a tendency to fire certain specific circuits in our brain. And those circuits are always related to a concern about the environment and things in the environment or people in the environment or places in the environment, events in the environment, our bodies and the sensory feedback that our body's feeling, and this concept of linear time. And in order to create a different state of mind, we have to rewire the brain. And that takes paying attention, and it takes learning new knowledge. Learning is making new connections in the brain. Learning is actually forming new circuits in the brain. Remembering is sustaining or maintaining those connections. So once we're able to learn new things and be able to wire it in there by maintaining and sustaining those connections, then to be able to process that level of mind at will without our mind running back to old circuits is the art.
And what exactly happens then? So we change our thought patterns. So what is happening in the brain? Is it physically changing?
It's a great
the
question.
Actual brain?
Yeah. Well, the way the brain likes to learn and develop is it likes to replace new concepts, or it likes to upgrade its hardware with new information. So if we were changing from being a certain particular aspect of ourselves to a new aspect of ourselves, we would have to design an idea, design a concept, design a model. And then by getting clear on what that model is, and then being able to mentally rehearse, going through a process of focused concentration, the process of contemplation and focusing is the building process itself. It allows those circuits to begin to form and develop. Now, most of the time, people can't pay attention for more than 6 seconds before their mind wandering somewhere else, because we're distracted constantly by our environment. We're distracted by the needs of our body. And it seems like everybody has attention deficit disorder because we're such a society that's based on convenience. Well, in order to begin to cause the brain to fire in new patterns, it takes a certain amount of will. And when we start developing those circuits, what happens is the glue that was holding those old circuits in place is used to form the new circuits. And so there's a pruning process that goes along with this, that as we begin to develop a new state of mind, that old mind falls away. Now, it sounds technically easy, but when you sit down and close your eyes and begin to think about something that you want to become, or a new experience you want to have in your life, or healing your body, your mind is such an untrained horse that it thinks it's in control. Then in a matter of seconds, the next thing you know, you're thinking about something completely different. So that process of focused concentration, paying attention, as neuroscience calls it, is a skill in itself. It's an art to be able to develop.
Now, do you think living in our societies, and I know a lot of indigenous cultures know a lot of these things already, like the power of thought, and they can psycho-navigate. There's people also can who say they can transform themselves into other shapes, shape-shifting and all that kind of those kind of stories. Why do you think that in our culture that we have a sensory overload from a very early age, and does that have any sort of direct correlation with that? The fact that we are so involved in the material world as opposed to anything more spiritual?
The material world and materialism, it has become kind of the focus of our culture.
Right.
This concept of spirituality, or this concept of consciousness, or the immaterial aspect of ourselves, most people don't have the time to engage in. And then we have to talk about religion, and religion and spirituality are different things. I think, though, if people keep their attention on their potential, I think it transcends really culture and race and gender and creed, and it transcends religion, that every human being has the potential to be great, and every human being has the potential to be the hero in their own life. If we start there, and we start making measurable changes for ourselves, I think that everybody will become empowered to be greater. Now, down the road in human potential, is there potentials for all those things that you mentioned? I'm sure there are. But we still have to retire the old programs in order to get to those new levels.
So let's talk about some of that 90% that we're missing out of the brain.
Well, actually, the whole concept that we use 10% of our brain, it's actually not that we use 10% of our brain and the other 90% is dormant. It's that functionally we use 10% of our brain. So on functional brain scans, you just see certain areas lighting up.
So does that include the subconscious? Is not included in that 10%?
Well, the subconscious, if you look at the unfunctional brain scans, if you look at the brain, a working brain on a functional MRI or a PET scan or a SPECT scan, the subconscious mind pretty much is always working. It's the motor of the brain. It's the microprocessor. it's pretty much powering this big neocortex, this big thinking brain that we have, because it's digesting your food now, it's filtering your blood through the kidneys, it's making about 10 million cells every second, it's processing 100,000 chemical reactions in each cell, so it's got quite a big job to do. And so that subconscious mind is always working. The idea is to be able to unify conscious mind and subconscious mind. Once we enter into that process, now we have access to greater potential.
And how do we do that?
Well, that's something
age-old question.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, that's the age-old question. But it's not something that you can answer in one, you know, in a short amount of time. But I will tell you this: that when the frontal lobe begins working properly, that frontal lobe is the most developed neurological piece of hardware that we have. It's the latest on the scene. It makes up 40% of our entire brain. It's what separates us from every other species. When we're truly concentrating...
So only human beings have a frontal lobe
that
working?
Size.
That
size.
Okay.
I mean, the next closest species is the great apes and the chimps, and they're somewhere between 14 and 17%. But the frontal lobe is the area where we concentrate, where we invent, where we speculate, where we create possibilities. And when we use the frontal lobe properly, when we activate that part of the brain, as a human being, we have the privilege of making thought more real than anything else. Because when we're able to hold an idea in our mind according to those functional brain scans, the frontal lobe is like the symphony leader. It has a tendency to quiet down the motor cortex and the visual cortex and the sensory cortex and the auditory cortex and the emotional centers. And when it quiets those areas down, pretty much those areas are no longer processing mind. And now the only thing that becomes real is that thought in that moment. Once that thought is captured in the brain like that, then it's mapped in pattern as a set of neurological connections. To be able to revisit those connections then and reproduce that same state of mind is the art. Now, how do we make it subconscious? To make it subconscious means we have to make it what's called implicit. And implicit memory is a non-declarative memory. In other words, we've practiced it so much that we don't have to think about it anymore. And we have, you know, hundreds of thousands of implicit systems intact that pretty much don't serve us as human beings. Those are the things that have to do with suffering and all the human conditions. But neurologically speaking, we can create the same hardware, we can create the same systems for so many different ideals that we haven't even began to explore. Now, the world and its contemporary society, there isn't a lot of support for greatness, because through media and through the brainwashing of television commercials.
Is that deliberate, do you think? Or?
I don't know if it's deliberate. I think it's dependent, though, because if this is corporate America and you only have a certain amount of resources to choose from, most people will choose resources that are available. So that doesn't really leave a whole lot of room for speculation and possibility or becoming at cause in our own world. Pretty much free will becomes factored out of the equation. You may think you have free will, but really you're making a choice based on what's available. So the person who is serious about change and serious about making their brain and mind work differently, there's plenty of room in the brain to be able to develop new thoughts and new systems. And all we need is knowledge. All we need is information.
Now, I know you talked in What to Believe a lot about emotional addictions, and there was a lot of to do with that in the movie. Let's talk about that.
Well,
I know all of us.
Yeah, the concept of emotional addictions is a concept taught at RSE, at Ramtha School of Enlightenment. I had the privilege of teaching it there for a while. But this simply said is that every time we react to our environment, every time we respond to our external world, and we're perceiving something in our world as a threat or a stress, there's this primitive nervous system that turns on. That's the fight or flight nervous system. And when that nervous system turns on, there's a rush of adrenaline. And that rush of adrenaline gives the person a high, gives them a feeling of aliveness. Adrenaline creates heightened state of awareness. So when we start to feel hyper-aware, because the neocortex has a tendency to learn by association, we tend to learn to associate that rush or that high or that change in chemical state with some external stimuli. You see, that's the nature of how we're wired. We'll always look for some external stimulus to identify with some change in internal chemical state. And that process is an event in itself. When we can say, oh, that stimulus has changed my chemistry, that association, we tend to start associating that rush of adrenaline with a high and feeling alive, and we get addicted pretty much to that feeling, and we get addicted to all the stimulants that cause that, namely people in our lives. And so then my definition of an addiction is always something that you can't stop. Well, those chemicals are so strong and the feelings that are created from them are so real that people really, because of the enlarged brain that we have, we store a lot of memory there. And if we can store a lot of memory there, psychological stress, all stress winds up as psychological stress. Right. Physical stress, chemical stress, all winds up as psychological stress. And the reason being is we got a big memory bank, and we can anticipate, we can expect. And so when we anticipate and we expect, we create the same chemicals as if we were actually involved in the experience. So our very thoughts become the trigger that produce the same chemicals that then become the auto-suggestion that run the body to try to keep it alive. The problem is that we wear out our systems when we do that. We're headed for a specific genetic outcome that's equal to what our parents experienced physically, emotionally, chemically. And so you have this big brain that's used for learning and remembering and dreaming and storing new ideas and speculating possibilities. But when it's driven by a chemically based brain that's based in survival, then all of the awareness that could be used for new possibilities is now being endorsed or being driven by a primitive system that's causing the body to become super aware about the environment and super aware about sensations and time.
Do you think most people live or exist in this state?
Yeah.
And how can we get out of that?
Yeah, well, that's the art. That's why the school
some kind of technique.
The school, you know, the disciplines in the school are all about that. But
right.
I mean, said simply, when you separate yourself from your environment, when you separate yourself from your body, and you forget about time, those are the moments where you're quieting down those systems. And the frontal lobe is the area of our brain that allows us to do that. And what neuroscience is beginning to understand is that the less of the activity that's in the frontal lobe, the higher propensity for emotional outbursts.
So the less in the frontal lobe.
Right. The greater the ability of frontal lobe activity, the less propensity for impulsive activity and emotional behavior.
So how do we get to the frontal lobe, get our thoughts there?
Well, our thoughts are, we do tend to use the frontal lobe quite a bit when we're learning.
Right.
But there is this concept called rehearsal that I'm very, very interested in. And the concept of rehearsal is getting ourselves to be able to rehearse being or doing something as if we were actually doing it. And neuroscience shows that the brain can make those new circuits. Most people would say, I want to be healthy, or I want to be well, or I want a new relationship, or I want to change this attitude. But they don't have the will or the instruction, for that matter, to sit down and be able to go through a process. Because most people don't even know what meditation is. People say they meditate, but meditation is clearing the mind. But then what do you want to become? That's the question. And so we're distracted. We're distracted by television, we're distracted by media, we're distracted by a host of things, new cars and making it to the top, and so that's a great distraction, and human potential becomes overlooked.
So it's an art then to get yourself into this subconscious state that you can quiet down and forget about yourself, in essence, right?
Actually it's a great way to say it. When you forget about being yourself,
right, is
the moment that you're actually embracing a new idea.
Right.
And if we look at the idea of losing track of yourself, it means that you're losing track of all your associations to your external world,
right,
losing track of how you identify yourself as a personality or as an identity to some external stimuli. That when we use the frontal lobe that way, the beauty is something very simple, and that is that we can change in one lifetime. We can evolve in one lifetime instead of normal other species that have to go through a series of environmental stimuli, embrace that stimuli, remember the stimuli, pass on that genetics to the next, and over a series of generations, there's a mutation that takes place.
So by human evolution, you mean using the brain effectively?
Well, the frontal lobe allows us to skip that process. We can do it in the same lifetime.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about how our thoughts can affect what's out there, what we call reality, and the nature of reality in general. This is what this show is all about. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think for me personally, the biggest thing that I look for is feedback in my world. I mean, even neuroscience says that in order for the brain to learn something, we need feedback to know that we're doing it right, and feedback to know when we're not doing it right. And so the concept of creating reality, the concept of using our mind to produce an intended result, it's pretty much a natural law that's been overlooked. Quantum physics says that the observer has an effect on the nature of reality. When quantum physics begins to measure subatomic particles, they have a tendency to show up wherever we anticipate them being. And so now this whole idea of mind and matter being separate has now begun to become merged, and that when mind and matter become merged, we begin to see that somehow we have an effect on the nature of reality. Now, most quantum physicists will say, well, that only works for the very tiny, it doesn't work for the very large. Right. But maybe we're just poor observers. Maybe we can develop a greater level of mind, we can develop the skill of observation, and when we develop that skill of observation, wire new knowledge in there, we'll begin to see what has always existed, but we weren't wired to even perceive it. And so the concept of creating reality is we can't really perceive anything new in our reality unless first we wire it in there, and once it's wired in there, we'll be able to see what a new potential.
What can people do then to sort of get away from this, these distractions, as well as meditation? And there's a lot of different kinds of meditation.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I think that learning as much information as you can about quantum physics and about neuroscience and about mind, brain, body gives people really the permission to change. And then the school in the Northwest, the Ramtha School of Enlightenment, is an excellent school. It's a laboratory of the mind. It's a place where people can go and practice. Really, the disciplines are designed that you practice paying attention, and you gain knowledge. And then it's not just going to be philosophical. It's not going to be dinner. It's not going to be dinner conversation. Right. You're going to go out, and you're going to go out and actually apply it. So, people, I think that asking the important questions, asking big questions. Are you tired of the same life? Are you tired of a predictable outcome that you can predict your life every single day? And if you can do that, then how can we begin to make different choices? And how can we begin to learn knowledge, and then not only learn that knowledge, but then personalize that knowledge, apply that knowledge, demonstrate that knowledge to produce a different experience. That's what knowledge is for. Knowledge is to modify our behavior to produce a different outcome. That's what this concept of neuroplasticity is all about.
Now you got a new book coming out soon, Evolving Your Brain, the Science of Changing Your Mind.
There you go.
All right. Tell us a little bit about that. And
well, it was inspired by my work at the RC school. It's taken me quite a while to finish, but I'm happy that it's just about done. And it's really about how we can make permanent long-term changes in our mind and retire pretty much some of those old attitudes that don't serve us. There's scientific explanations for it, and in a conversational way that people can understand. And we talk about how stress affects the body, how it affects the mind, how emotions are mismanaged and what emotions are really for. And it talks about this concept of the biology of change, how can we become different people.
That sounds fascinating. Joe Dispenza's work and his ideas, you can find all about it, www.drjoedispenza.com. That's www.drjoedispenza.com. Now, what are you doing at the moment, and what are your plans for future presentations?
I'm actually going to go back to school.
Again?
Again,
Right.
I'm going to get my master's.
Right.
And I want to do research is what I really want to do. I'll do some lecturing and...
in neurology?
yeah, in neuroscience.
Neuroscience,
yeah.
right.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
my interest. I actually want to do a lot of functional brain scan experiments, yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, studying mind.
Okay.
Studying
all right.
mind, yeah.
All right. And how do you do that in laboratory? You just study people?
It's a great question. So when they used to do experiments on the brain, they used to take snapshots, like with a CAT scan or an MRI, and that really tells if there's pathologies in the brain, if there's any lesions. Functional scans measure the brain in action, and when you measure the brain in action, you can measure mind, and you can begin to see repeatable patterns with different psychological conditions or different traits that are advantageous. And by studying those different patterns, we're able to gain and gather important information about what it takes to change.
So what kind of volunteers are you looking for?
Oh, all kinds, all kinds, yeah.
So you go to all walks of life and just study people's different reactions to
Well,
things?
no, it would be like what happens during concentration, what happens during learning, what happens during anxiety, what happens during depression, what happens with attention deficit disorder, what happens with different types of attention deficit disorder, what happens with strokes and traumas, and what happens when people have strokes and traumas and then they're able to use a limb again and other people who can't. What is the process that allows that to take place? So interesting thing that hopefully advances our understandings.
Joe, that's about all we have time for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to you at home for watching as well. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. It's all food for thought. So good night and have a good one.